Hello, everybody. We are open to week 12, where we will be covering chapter 11, which is all about groups and individuals. Here is the to-do list for this chapter. Let's jump into the objectives here. So we're going to start out by talking about what is meant by a group. So getting a good definition of a group and the role that groups play in our lives and our everyday roles that we have. We'll be looking at some concepts that we've talked about in prior chapters, but now applying them to this idea of groups. So role, status, norms, and then cohesiveness of a group are all distinct features of how a group functions. We'll look at what the benefits or costs are to joining a group or being a part of a group. And once you are in a group, what are the roles within that group? Every group has different defining features and roles, and the power is different depending upon what role you play and where you stand within the group. And that can often dictate one's behavior. So a lot of what we covered when we looked at social influence and we looked at conformity and obedience and compliance, a lot of those factors are going to be really salient here as we're talking about the individual embedded within a larger social group. So I want you kind of thinking about some of those concepts, even having your notes from that chapter nearby as you're reading through would be really helpful. We'll take a look at how the group can change or alter a person's behavior via social facilitation as well as social loafing. Those are two ways that people act within a group setting that can either enhance or inhibit their performance. We'll also talk about de-individuation, which we mentioned in the social influence chapter, but we'll look at it here in terms of how the individual gets lost within the group and how this can be a negative thing and lead to negative social behaviors. We'll also look at cooperation and conflict, the elements and dynamics of social dilemmas, what to do when you don't know what to do, and how we often use the group as our source of information to inform our behavior. We'll look at reciprocity, personal orientations, and different aspects of communication and how those are essential in cooperation in group settings like the workplace or like juries, especially when people have to come to a conclusion or come to a resolution, and that's going to require the cooperation of everyone in the group. We'll look at the basic nature and causes of conflict and the various ways to reduce it, looking at different categories of justice. So here's where we really start to intertwine some applied aspects of psychology with the criminal justice system, and just aspects of social justice as well. What happens when people perceive unfairness? What are some of the social decision schemes that a group might make or decide to pursue in their pursuit of a resolution or a determination? And then we'll look at where this can sort of go down a negative path, looking at the nature and consequences of group polarization as well as group think. So these are dynamics that take place within the group setting of how individuals contribute to an overall thought or an overall mode of rationalization that tends to take on its own entity within the group and can be very negative and can really blind people to the negative aspects of their decision when everybody's on board with it. We might not be thinking about the downside or the consequences or the cons of a particular route of action because we are energized or supported by the group in our decision making. And so we'll look at some resolutions for that, some solutions in terms of what can groups do to sort of buffer themselves against the negative effects of groupthink, using techniques like devil's advocate and authentic dissent. These are ways that we can spur groups to challenge their members to not sink into the negative realities of groupthink. So that concludes chapter 11. We're going to be taking a look at Article 25, which is all about the Stanford Prison Study. I really want you to read this article first, and then you're going to be watching the original study done by Phil Zimbardo at Stanford University. This is a classic study used to look at group dynamics, obedience to authority, the roles that we take on and play, how we can become de-individualized in a setting in which we are playing a role and we are part of a group. Our social identity starts to sort of kick in. We talked about social identity when we looked at the self. We lose a little bit more of our personal identity and we gravitate towards the identity of the group. So this video really looks at how a group influences individuals, how situational variables influence an individual, and those situational forces can be most salient in a setting like a prison setting. So definitely read this article first, and then you're going to want to watch this video. Those are going to be tied to your discussion questions for this week. I do have an additional 2 quick videos specifically dealing with social facilitation, social loafing, and then this one you'll recall we did the first half of it when we covered social influence. So the second half is the groupthink part. So it's like conformity is essential, and understanding that leads to how we can think of groups influencing our conformity. And this happens in the concept of groupthink. So you can definitely re-watch the whole video. It's only like 4 or 5 minutes. But really you want to zone in on the last half of it where it talks about groupthink and how conformity influences groupthink. So for the discussion question for this week, more importantly, you're going to be integrating all of those sources. So the article, the chapter, and then the videos. The first question asks, could anyone, including you, be induced to act in the same way as the prisoners or guards if put into the same situation in the Stanford Prison Study? Okay. How do you think you would act? What elements were most salient for understanding why the guards acted the way that they did and the prisoners acted the way that they did? What role does personality play, if any, or free will, when a situation is so intense like that of the Stanford Prison situation study? So I really want you kind of thinking a little bit more outside the box in terms of how would you explain the behavior of those in the study. So here's where you should be citing concepts from the readings that will help inform your answer, right? And then the second part of the question asks you to discuss factors that contribute to de-individuation. So what elements cause someone to act as less of an individual and take on more of the group behavior dynamic? And how did we see that happening in the Stanford Prison Study? Okay, what were some specific examples of that? Be specific, give key examples from either the reading or the video that help understand that a little bit more. And so that wraps up the week. And I do want to say, just with the Stanford Prison Study, if it's not opening for you, please follow these instructions. Definitely best to use Google Chrome. For some reason, if you're using a Mac, Safari doesn't work well, Firefox doesn't work well. So I wouldn't use those. Even Internet Explorer, some people have had some issues. So check it out using Google Chrome and see if that doesn't help you to be able to open the video. If all else fails, you can find it on YouTube. The original study is on YouTube as well. So, okay, if you have any questions about this week's material, please feel free to email me, and I'll be available to answer any of those questions. Thanks, everyone.